When I was a young lad in the now ancient era of the 1990s, Halloween wasn't just a night of spooky stories and strange superstitions, but actually had a very real and tangible threat, particularly when it came to trick-or-treating. Now, admittedly, I don't think trick-or-treating was that big of a deal in the UK, at least where I grew up, and it certainly seems to have been more of an American thing, although it does seem to be growing in popularity. Stranger danger was at an all-time high back then, and the sentiment that you didn't accept candy from strangers, or, God forbid, follow them back to their vans, went doubly so on Halloween night.
Hi, Sally.
Do I know you?
The rhetoric implied that if these deviants were trying to lure kids with candy on a normal day, then God knows what they were going to do with the candy on Halloween. I found during my research for this episode that such a notion was also pretty big in the US too. In fact, parents were warned yearly by the mainstream media to actively search through the candy their children had received, and forbade them from eating any of it until the inspection was over. Naturally, this gave rise to the idea that there really were some sickos out there poisoning sweets and chocolate, or tampering with gifts so as to make children sick or worse. Yet, if you think back, how many people do you actually know who ever got poisoned on Halloween? I mean, yeah, you probably stuffed your fat face a bit too much and now you feel sick, but I'm willing to bet that you never had ricin slipped into your goodie bags. You might therefore be relieved to know that cases of strangers handing out contaminated candy are actually pretty rare, considering that there aren't really that many reports of it actually happening. Indeed, the tampering of sweets on Halloween night appear to be something of a widespread urban legend, and yet the fear of one's child swallowing a poisoned M&M or ingesting a chocolate-covered laxative of doom still persist, even to the more elaborate snacks of concealing razor blades in apples. Who the hell gives out fruit on Halloween anyway? Somehow the diabolical combination of blades and apples have gone hand in hand during the Halloween season. And at least before the turn of the century, this weaponized poem has become the symbol for fears of what's been dubbed Halloween sadism. But why the apple in particular? And why has this twisted concept become so synonymous with trick or treat? Especially when no cases of an apple containing razor blades have ever been reported. According to an article by sociologists Joel Best and Gerald T. Horiuchi titled The Razor Blade and the Apple, The Social Construction of Urban Legends, the concept of the Halloween sadist and Halloween sadism in general began in the early 1970s, where it was believed and soon reported by the likes of the New York Times that there were unscrupulous members of the public actively handing out tainted and harmful treats to children. The New York Times printed in 1970, "That plump red apple that Junior gets from a kindly old woman down the block may have a blade hidden inside." The publication Newsweek in 1975 followed suit, declaring, "If this year's Halloween follows form, a few children will return home with something more than an upset tummy." In recent years, several children have died and hundreds have narrowly escaped injury from blades, sewing needles, and shards of glass purposefully put into their goodies by adults. By 1985, columnist Abigail Van Buren wrote rather assuredly and scathingly of Halloween that it's Halloween again, and time to remind you that somebody's child will become violently ill after eating poisoned candy or an apple containing a razor blade. Throughout the 70s and 80s, the idea of Halloween sadism was taken very seriously. Many parents were advised to forbid their children from partaking in the otherwise neighbourly activity, or were encouraged by the media to inspect the candy haul and dispose of anything that wasn't factory sealed or at least a recognisable brand. Some communities aimed to even ban trick-or-treating altogether, while states including New Jersey and California actually incorporated legislation to discourage Halloween sadism, which goes to show how seriously the authorities were taking it. Publications like the New York Times even established something of a psychological profile for these deviants, noting them as being child haters and those who had been deprived of childhoods themselves and abused as children. They were now frustrated and filled with resentment against the world in general. Evidently, this Halloween sadism was a well-known phenomena and something that people were soon convinced was actually part and parcel with the season's festivities. Yet according to the aforementioned article by Joel Best and Gerald Horiuchi, there are no reliable statistics to indicate that the poisoning of candy and the harmful alteration of trees were ever a reasonable threat. At least not on the scale that the media would have you believe. Imagine that, the media blowing something out of proportion. According to the study by Best and Horiuchi, there were 76 reported cases of Halloween sadism between 1959 and 1984, when consulting the reports across the New York Times, the LA Times, and the Fresno Bee. Of the 76 reports, some of which included stories from other states outside of the paper's respective regions, none were believed to be serious, with the exception of 2 that involved deaths. 31 of these cases appeared to transpire between the years 1969 and 1971, where it would appear that more and more people had become aware of the dark trend, and that according to the media, perpetrators were becoming more active. Before this, newspapers and magazines were warning revelers over the likes of flammable costumes and headwear that could impair vision. By 1970, they were warning of razor blades and sewing pins hidden in apples, bubblegum sprinkled with lye, popcorn balls coated with camphor, loose sleeping pills, and red-hot oven-baked pennies that would burn children. Prior to this year though, the concept of Halloween sadism doesn't appear to have been taken that seriously, and any incidences of such a thing transpiring were likely considered to be isolatory, if not horrendous. The first date that sees an act of Halloween sadism in Best and Horiuchi's study is 1959, likely referring to the case of William V. Shine, a successful and well-respected dentist living in California. During this time, poisoning and tampering with children's candy was just not something that was ever conceived of. So naturally, no one was particularly vigilant about anything of the like transpiring, especially not the likes of William V. Shine, an unassuming married man who by all appearances was just a regular bloke. Still, on October 31st, 1959, Shine was believed to have distributed 450 white sugar-coated heart-shaped pills to trick-or-treaters who happened upon his door. The pills were aloe pills, a mild form of laxative, and whilst they weren't tremendously harmful, it's still kind of messed up giving them to kids. Besides, who knows what kind of adverse side effects might have come into play back then. What's more, it's the effort he took to carve them into heart shapes and sprinkle them with sugar that makes it really disturbing. Parents of concerned children baited Shine into a trap by having their older children obtain more pills in their candy bags, which was then presented to the police as evidence of his involvement. Yet even after being taken into court and appearing before a judge, Shine never admitted to distributing the pills at all. Nonetheless, Shine's reputation was ruined, and with it, the first speck of degradation was spattered on the name of Halloween. After all, it was the first time the media could associate the idea of tainted treats with the festivities of Halloween, and whilst laxatives were by no means on the same level as razors in apples, it was still menacing enough to be a cause for concern. Fast forward 6 years, and another case of this Halloween sadism creeps its way into the limelight, in the 1964 case of Helen File, who had given trick-or-treaters packages of insect traps, steel wool pads, and dog biscuits wrapped in aluminium foil. Now, steel wool pads and dog biscuits sound like the work of a practical joker, but the insect traps were believed to be poisonous. Luckily, no children were harmed during this incident, but the case was so unusual and so unheard of during that time that it actually made national news. File later claimed that she had handed out these items as a joke and that she felt many of the children doing the trick-or-treating in her area were too old to participate. But whatever her reasons, it was cases like this that began to solidify the notion that Halloween sadism was really a thing, and that whilst it may have been unheard of before, It certainly presented a new horror concerning what people were capable of, and showed that feeding children poison under the guise of sweets was something that grown adults were more than willing to do. Based on these accounts, the 1975 Newsweek article that spread the idea that, and I quote, "in recent years several children have died," was simply a gross exaggeration. According to Best and Horiuchi, there were only 2 cases from the 76 reported where a child had died, and neither one of these was a result of some sick and deranged cabal of lunatics lacing candy with poison, or infusing pins and needles into fruit. Still, it was these 2 accounts that one might say spearheaded the hysteria around Halloween for decades to come. The first appears to have been a tragic occurrence where 5-year-old Kevin Toston died after consuming candy that at first was believed to have been laced with poison. Toston had been trick-or-treating with his uncle before falling ill and passing away. His family were quick to notify the police that they suspected Kevin had been poisoned by some villain handing out candy. And they were half right, because a portion of the candy had indeed been sprinkled with heroin. However, it was later revealed that the young Kevin had actually been in his uncle's house and had found his uncle's stash of drugs, including capsules of heroin which he had consumed. Fearing that they would be accused of negligence, the family themselves sprinkled the candy with heroin, hoping to capitalize on the paranoia and superstition of Halloween sadism, and thus vindicate themselves of any wrongdoing. Whilst Toston's family weren't successful in their efforts to scapegoat Halloween, they were successful in further sullying its reputation, and further spreading the misconception that there were people actively poisoning candy. The second involved the death of Timothy O'Brien in 1974, which saw Father Ronald O'Brien take Timothy and his sister Elizabeth trick-or-treating in Pasadena, Texas. After visiting one home where the occupant did not answer his door, the children decided to move on, but Ronald stayed behind to wait. Eventually catching up to his children, who were accompanied by a neighbor and his children, Ronald produced a 21-inch pixie stick and claimed he had obtained it from the occupant who had failed to answer the door. Suspecting nothing amiss with this, Ronald's children Timothy and Elizabeth, as well as the children of Ronald's neighbor, each accepted a portion of the giant pixie stick. After tasting the candy, Timothy complained it tasted bitter, so Ronald gave his son Kool-Aid to wash it down with. Almost immediately, Timothy began to complain of a stomachache, and in a matter of moments was vomiting and convulsing. In less than an hour after consuming the candy, Timothy was dead. Timothy's death sparked great outrage amongst the community, many of whom began turning in the candy their children had acquired to the police, fearing it too was laced with the same poison that had killed Timothy. You can certainly see how the precaution of inspecting children's candy began to take root here. 4 of the 5 pixie sticks Ronald claimed to have received were recovered by the police, and luckily, none of the others had consumed that particular candy. It would later turn out that the culprit behind this dastardly scheme was none other than Ronald himself, who had previously taken out a life insurance policy on Timothy a week before. Despite maintaining his innocence, the evidence the police were able to surmount against him was overwhelming. Considering his actions had further marred the already diminishing trust between trick-or-treaters and strangers, Ronald O'Brien was posthumously dubbed as the man who not only killed his own son, but the man who killed Halloween. It's easy to see why people feared trick-or-treating during this time, and were quick to believe the sensationalism purported by the media. In light of tragedies like the deaths of Kevin Toston and Timothy O'Brien, the idea that a stranger might tamper with children's treats, slipping poison into candy, or hiding razor blades in apples was only made all the more plausible. We only need to look at how it was reported in the wake of these incidents to see how such urban legends were further cemented into our collective consciousness, especially when people in authoritative positions appear to confirm them as real. In the case of Kevin Toston, Sergeant Peter Kekic of Detroit Police Department was interviewed in the Pennsylvania Intelligence Journal, where he stated, "It's an unusual case, and we can't rule out anything at this point. It would be unusual for a dope peddler or user to give heroin away to children, but there are people who put razor blades in apples, so it's hard to tell." However, as per Best and Horiuchi, it's important to remember that the death of these two children were not at the hands of the perpetuated Halloween sadists, certainly not by those spending their free time putting razor blades into apples, but rather by those who were close to them, as is the case with most crimes against children, and by those who were using Halloween and the paranoia surrounding trick-or-treating as a means to basically get away with murder. Another conclusion that can be drawn regarding Halloween sadism and its perpetuation is that people just make these stories up in the same way one might make up a ghost story to spook friends, or tell a chilling encounter, all for the sake of attention. Children unfortunately fit quite well into this category and make for the perfect culprits, for not only are they aware of the concept of Halloween sadism, having been thoroughly warned by parents and teachers, but they also possess incentive to create such fiction. In the article Halloween in America, Contemporary Customs and Performances, writer Jack Santino notes that it's always a child who discovers the poison candy, or the pill amongst the sweets, or the blade in the apple, usually before consuming the item so as to forego injury or ailment, and then are subsequently rewarded with the concerned attention of the parent. Best notes in his study of the 76 cases of Halloween sadism that it is remarkable that the 3/4 of the children who reported receiving contaminated treats had no injuries. The New York Times was notorious for reporting cases of children being cut by booby-trapped apples, and even the more detailed accounts easily aroused suspicion. For example, in one case, a boy had discovered a razor blade in an apple, but had just happened to bite around it. Another incident claims a boy found a razor blade when cutting out a rotten spot on the apple, whilst another was discovered when a boy handed the apple to his father for peeling. In all the cases presented by the papers, it would appear that the children in question, if they ever even existed, were never actually injured. Therefore, there would be no hospital records, and thus no means to verify said accounts. What's more, if these cases were real, then you might say it was mightily convenient that the children discover the blade before any harm occurs. Thus it might be concluded that if the child is always the one to find the razor blade, it's likely he was the one who also put it there. According to Best, despite the reports in the New York Times regarding these cases, follow-up investigations have since deemed these accounts to be fictional or inauthentic. He further notes, 24 of the nation's largest cities, as well as smaller towns in which highly publicized incidents were alleged to have occurred, found 2 reports of injuries, neither requiring medical treatment, from among the hundreds of claims of candy tampering. Thus, not only does a survey of press coverage reveal fewer reports of Halloween sadism than might be expected, but there is good reason to suspect that many of the reports are unfounded. By the late 1970s, poisoned candy began to fall out of favour and was supplanted in some areas by pins and needles. People sneaking pins into candy bars, needles into chocolate, or razors into apples were the new menaces that were plaguing Halloween night, and whilst these weren't as fatal as poisoning, they were still nonetheless gruesomely macabre. No one is certain where the urban legends came from, and while some indicate it first grew roots on the East Coast in Canada and had been popular since the 1960s, its true origin is simply lost to us. Nonetheless, despite its obscure origin, the outrage of such a fiendish invention designed to harm children was so palpable in some states that the likes of New Jersey would even pass legislation mandating prison sentences for those found to be guilty of tampering with apples. A 1968 broadcast in Canada seeking to raise awareness about the potential danger of tampered apples on Halloween, only served to fuel hysteria. On the TV show The Day It Is, Toronto Police Department showcased several apples believed to have been booby-trapped with razor blades and needles. Other broadcasts, including infomercials by various police departments, were also believed to circulate regionally, though it is commonly believed today that the apples shown in these broadcasts were not impounded evidence, but rather props used to inform parents of the potential danger of trick-or-treating, and to encourage parents to investigate their child's candy haul. Of course, the visual representation of such a twisted contraption as a razor blade and an apple just convinced people that this was actually happening. And knowing that boomer generation, they immediately believed it was true because they'd seen it on TV. Despite the widespread idea of treat tampering that seems to be reawakened every Halloween, there simply aren't enough legitimate reports to warrant the fear that we have come to feel over it. As we've seen, much of the Halloween sadism, including the old razor blade in the apple, is almost certainly the work of journalists of the past, seeking to capitalize on and sensationalize superstition. We need only look to the 1970 op-ed piece in the New York Times by journalist Judy Klemsrud, titled "Those Treats May Be Tricks," to see that sensationalism in action. Klemsrud noted, "Within the last 5 years, the number of incidents involving poisonous or otherwise harmful treats given to young hobgoblins on Halloween has been growing at a rapid rate." This was actually published, despite the fact that Klemsrud had no statistical evidence for this claim and was merely perpetuating an already known urban legend. Not too many years ago, red hot pennies that had been heated in an oven were often handed out to trick-or-treaters by sadistic householders. Today, the most common mistreat seems to be the apple, that has more than just seeds inside. Again, another lie spun by Klemsrud, who, it must be said, probably had no idea how influential her little article in the paper would turn out to be, that it not only convinced an entire generation of parents, but transcended decades to become a mainstay Halloween horror. Last year in Oneida, New York, someone gave 3 children trick-or-treat apples with sewing needles in them, and in nearby Ilion, the father of a 5-year-old boy found a razor blade in an apple when he peeled it for the child. As told to us by the likes of Best and Santino, none of these accounts are actually verifiable, and whilst there was an effort here by Klemsrud to shine a light on the dangers of trick-or-treating, she more than exaggerated and didn't mind stretching the truth in order to get her point across. However, all she'd managed to do was fan the flames of existing fears, and merely contributed to the moral panic that Halloween was a dangerous time for children. Whilst the article "Those Treats May Be Tricks" isn't solely to blame for such caution and paranoia on the spookiest night of the year, it did reinforce many of the urban legends that probably kept millions of children from perfectly good candy. As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to leave this video a like and subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.